morning to our scripture reading. Today's scripture reading can be found in the Gospel of Luke, in the second section of the Bible commonly called the New Testament. No, Lucas Green did not write this book. You will find Luke between the Gospel of Mark and the Gospel of John. The reading is on page 79 in the Pew Bible. You can also access the reading on your tablet or smartphone via our internet access. From Luke chapter 16, verses 1 through 13. Then Jesus said to the disciples, there was a rich man who had a manager, and charges were brought to him that this man was squandering his property. So he summoned him and said to him, what is this that I hear about you? Give me an accounting of your management, because you cannot be my manager any longer. Then the manager said to himself, what will I do now that my master is taking the position away from me? I am not strong enough today, and I am ashamed to beg. I have decided what to do so that when I am dismissed as manager, people may welcome me into their homes. So, summoning his master's debtors one by one, he asked the first, how much do you owe my master? He answered, 100 jugs of oil. He said to him, take your bill, sit down quickly, and make it 50. He asked another, and how much do you owe? He replied, 100 containers of wheat. He said to him, take your bill and make it 80. And his master commended the dishonest manager because he had acted shrewdly. For the children of this age are more shrewd in dealing with their own generation than are the children of light. And I tell you, make friends for yourselves by means of dishonest wealth, so that when it is gone, they may welcome you into the eternal homes. Whoever is faithful in a very little is faithful also in much. And whoever is dishonest in a very little is dishonest also in much. If then you have not been faithful with the dishonest wealth, who will entrust to you the true riches? And if you have not been faithful with what belongs to another, who will give you what is your own? No slave can serve two masters. For a slave will either hate the one and love the other, or be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and wealth. Blessings on this reading of Holy Scripture this morning. This has been called a difficult parable to interpret of Jesus. It seems that it's rewarding dishonesty as a bit of a virtue at its face value. Now, there are parts in the parable that do perplex even the best scholars of Scripture, but perhaps gathering some of the known experiences of living in the Galilean and Judea regions of the Roman Empire during that first century, when Jesus lived, we might have a little help in understanding this parable. And those attached sayings about wealth and servitude might become a little less confusing here, because now I know that we rarely experience this kind of behavior 2,000 years later, but just imagine for yourself an occupied territory of a vast, powerful empire that is ran by wealthy people. I mean, when was the last time we were ran by wealthy people? The Romans have been ruling Palestine for nearly 100 years. And like many empires, empires do two things very well. They exploit the natural resources of the conquered territory for themselves, and then they exploit the labor of the conquered people in that same territory through heavy taxation. Again, aren't you glad we don't live in times like this? Only a few powerful people owning all of the resources and making as much money as possible out of the ordinary person. Thank God we are out of that world. Now, what we need is a little geography lesson here about Roman Palestine. I realize that some of us get lost on the way to Indianapolis, so let's be clear about our geography here. In the south area, in the Roman province of Judea, with its military religious capital, Jerusalem, lived a majority of these rich Romans and those who benefited from being around rich Romans. Now, rich Romans at that time required three things in life. They required wine, they require wheat, and they require olive oil for their banquets and their country club memberships, and a healthy dose of that ever-present, condescending masters of the known world who believe that anyone can get what they actually already received and never had to work for in the first place. Aren't you glad we don't have conceited rich people anymore? Now to the north, in the Roman province of Galilee, where Jesus is from, lived a majority of the poor farmers. Those would be the ones that actually had the real estate, the space to work, and also the experience of actually plowing the fields and planting, tending to grapevines to produce all that wine and that wheat and that olive oil for those who live in the luxurious suburbs of Jerusalem. Now, let's remember the most common version here of the golden rule. You know, the one that everyone still follows. He who has the most gold makes all the rules. Aren't you glad that wealthy people don't do this anymore? Guess who controls the taxes on the occupied people? The rich Romans. Guess who isn't taxed? Any guess?
Rich Romans.
The rich Romans aren't taxed. Guess who is taxed? The poor Galilean farmers who are providing the wine, the wheat, and the olive oil to who? The rich and untaxed Romans. Guess who can't pay their taxes? The poor Galilean farmers who are providing the wine, the wheat, and the olive oil to the rich and untaxed Romans. So guess who they have to sell for taxes? Guess what they have that they can pay their debts with? Farmland. Redeemed by providing to the person who purchased the certificate on the land in fees of wine, wheat, and olive oil to the rich and untaxed Romans. Farmers 2,000 years ago despised their debt holders just as much as they still hate bankers today. So will the rich Roman who owns the land, the rich Roman of Judea, go visit his land that he now owns due to the onerous taxation that the Roman has put upon it already? Oh, no. Rich Romans of Judea can't be taken too far from their Lake Decatur. I mean, their Jerusalem Country Club membership to deal with these miserly and likely lazy farmers that are now tax slaves who should just be pleased that they're still allowed to live there and to work their land with only those modest demands of making sure enough wheat, enough wine, and enough olive oil is flowing freely to the one and only benevolent master who holds the deed to the land. Oh no, we have to hire middle management to deal with the farmers. So they do. They hire managers that take care of making sure the wine, the wheat, and the olive oil arrives, and the farmers pay their dues. Oh, and the rich Roman, oh, he'll fire a manager who doesn't keep up with what is expected to be his return on investment, without much consideration of either the farmer who had the land, nor the manager's livelihood. We have had 3 parables just before this one about the lost sheep, the lost coin, and the lost sons. And Jesus is still speaking. He's speaking to his disciples, but his disciples' conversation is being overheard by the grumbling Pharisees. Remember those from last week that were grumbling that Jesus was eating with all the wrong kinds of people and forgiving sins and doing all those awful things? Because oftentimes Pharisees felt that God's favor was coming from simply right living and associating with all the right people. Well, you can imagine that a Pharisee that associates with a few of the right people and does a bit of right living grows a little wealthy by doing all the right things. But those who feel they are never lost are often found to actually be totally lost. And those who lose themselves in valuing the money will devalue and misuse people and turn a blind eye to any form of economic exploitation of which they're already benefiting from, of the resources or the labor that is in the slavery that wealth will deceptively bring every time. So it is surprising that there is this moment that the manager realizes, unlike his other fellow managers, that this rich man is corrupt and has become, in his relationship between the wine, the wheat, and the olive oil producers, and how negligible he is to the rich man in life work matters, to one who thinks he is always cheated, as rich men never do today. And the previous story we have is of squandering that involved that younger brother running off and spending his father's estate, or what third he got of it, in a questionable lifestyle arrangements, until finally, in the most impossible region possible, the most ridiculous position for a good Jewish boy, he's taking care of Gentiles' pig herds and actually envious of their discarded food. So now we catch the manager at the moment that he recognizes how far and how deep this pyramid scheme he is playing is him being played unwittingly. And now seeing how greedy his rich master truly is, and how onerous the demands are upon the debtors, the manager now acts in service of those who owe rather than in service of those who can and usually do collect. In the face of the overwhelming economic injustice, the manager in our story switches sides and favor to the poor rather than the rich. Now, the manager could be dismissed for revising these debts down by half for one of them and down by 20% for another. But the manager would also be received favorably by those whose debts have just been forgiven by half, or just forgiven by 20%. The manager has recognized what rich men or women never, ever do. That money and wealth isn't the ultimate measure of life. It's not the ultimate value. Literally, the totals can be changed on the rich man's balance sheet by a stroke of a pen. Come quickly, sit down and write this figure. And it's spent better seeking relationships with people rather than better profits from so-called benevolence. The better wealth in this story is drawn from using resources in service of relationships rather than relationships in service of money. Many of the world's problems are because we treat things like people, and people like things. Many of your problems are because you are treating people like things, and things like people. You place more value in your collections of stuff than your own friends, your own family, or even fellow human beings. And if you spend more time cleverly figuring out how you'll save your job from a boss who will put up that help wanted sign as soon as they're notified that you have passed away, how much more the benefit could there truly be if you spent that amount of work, that amount of effort in your life working in God's plan, of using those management skills toward the better relationships rather than the better profit margins. In other words, and Jesus says this frighteningly clear, you will hate one and love the other, or devote yourself to one and despise the other. What he says that we cannot do is serve both. You cannot love wealth without hating God, period. You cannot devote yourself to wealth without despising God. Because there will be always something God owns that you think you deserve. The manager has figured it all out. The whole sham of this Roman Galilean economic status quo. The boss will fire him at a moment's displeasure. The debtors are going to hate him for being associated with his former boss. The better path would be for him to make sure that the boss is paid some. Remember, he didn't eliminate their debts. He reduced one by 50 and he reduced one by 20%. But those who owed actually paying less than what the rich man and rich men always demand, which is often more than what anyone would consider fair. With God, it is better to side with those without than with those with too much. Because those with too much often have no room for God in their lives and will provide little room for you. And yet we try over and over again to squeeze the two masters into our lives in the wealth of resources and the wealth of relationships, and at the cost of service in God's kingdom. And it's God's kingdom that is everlasting. Checkbooks, savings accounts, IRAs, pension plans, property deeds may appear to be credits to us all, but they are not everlasting. Whether your savings account has $1 million or your savings account barely has $1 in it, it will be surrendered to a master. And it probably won't be you. We call possessions for a reason. because I think they have the ability to possess us, to consume us, even to take our lives. Be careful, then, in choosing what to possess. Your devotion, Jesus warns us, is at risk at that very moment. Be shrewd in recognizing greed in all of its forms, including even legal ones. And resist. That's what disciples do. Amen.